Hello, my name's Peter Meineck. I'm Professor of Classics in the Modern World at New York University, and today we're going to be breaking down Greek and Roman mythology in TV and film. This is a scene from the movie 300.
Spartan!
Yes, milady.
Come back with your shield. Or on it.
Yes, milady.
The 300. Where to start? A compelling movie and also a deeply problematical movie as well. The famous phrase, right? Come back carrying your shield or laying on it, which seems a pretty harsh thing for your wife to tell you when you're about to go and fight a battle and you know you're not coming home. I think it's Pausanias who actually documents this. He said that Spartan mothers actually said it to their sons, which is perhaps even harsher. It's not only a Spartan sentiment. The Athenians had a term of insult called a shield dropper. Anybody who dropped their shield in battle meant that they were retreating from the hoplite phalanx. The hoplite phalanx was that you would deploy your infantry, maybe 6,000 to 9,000 of them, and you would carry a large round shield called a hoplite, we see it in the movie, and that would cover half of your body, but it would also cover half of the body of the man to your left. So you were totally dependent on each other in battle. If you dropped your shield, it meant that not only were you a coward because you were running away, but you were also letting the line down.
He doesn't say it. There's no room for softness. Not in Sparta. No place for weakness. Only the hard and strong may call themselves Spartans. Only the hard. Only the strong.
I think what's so interesting about Spartan culture is we are fascinated with it, right? Because it seems to promote this idea of kind of male toughness. But actually, that's a little bit of a very repressive state to live in where everything is about the army. At the time this happens in Spartan history, the 7th, 6th century BC, all Spartan art stops, all Spartan poetry stops, and we just have this Spartan military. Spartan culture itself died out because they simply didn't produce enough children. Even though you were married, you stayed living in barracks until you were 30 years old. Men and women were pretty separate in that society. Their marriage system just did not work. And also, they were a very, very exclusive society. You could only be a Spartan if you were born in the 5 villages of Sparta. By the 4th century, Sparta was spent as a power. So, historically, the Spartan system was not successful at all. So it's probably not something we should emulate. I mean, I was so shocked to see people on January the 6th attacking the Capitol, dressing up as Spartans and running around. And, should think about, right, is that this was perhaps the greatest gay army that's ever been on the planet. Famously bisexual, as many people were in antiquity, very different ideas about sexuality. They lived together as men in messes, and the Spartans were very much into each other, great bisexual army in many ways. That's another way that they've been sort of misinterpreted, that somehow they convey this kind of idea of, certain masculinity. That is not attested at all in the ancient sources. But having said that, I think they get certain things right, okay? There's no doubt Spartan warriors, all Greek warriors, were very interested in physical fitness. They were very interested in the male body. They were often depicted nude in Greek art. And the women too had to undergo physical exercise in order to give strong babies for the Spartan army. They did wear red cloaks as a way to kind of soak up the blood on the battlefield, but also to designate themselves that they were Spartans. And it was considered manly to have a very long beard. One of the things I really don't like about this movie, The 300, is the way that the Persians are presented. They're almost non-human. Twisted and as kind of vile, and to me it's really quite racist actually, and it's kind of promoting white supremacy versus this horrible kind of invasion of brown people, and it's completely inaccurate. I mean, one of the things about the Persian Empire that even the Greeks tell is how multi-ethnic it was and how it had people from all over the world in their army. And the battle tactics of the great king was he would literally turn up with his 1,000,000-man army and you just surrendered, right? Because how could you possibly take an army like that on? But you don't see these kind of racist and xenophobic attitudes in the Greek texts. In fact, Aeschylus, who fought at the Battle of Marathon and lost a brother there, he was a playwright and he also served in the military. He actually wrote a play called The Persians, and we actually feel sympathy for the Persians in their defeat, and we feel their pain and we feel the losses that's happened to them. And I think this is the thing that really makes me uncomfortable about this film.
There is such a route, good king. Just past that western ridge. It's an old goat path. The Persians could use it to outflank us.
Not one step closer. Monster.
There actually is accounts of a character like that and a kind of rejected Spartan character who does actually go over to the enemy. He's certainly nowhere near as deformed as this character. And again, that's also kind of very problematic, right? There's a connection between physical perfection, beauty, and loyalty and truth. Because this character doesn't fit that ideal, he has to be deceitful. This is actually the opposite of what you find in Greek mythology. Characters like that are often given a second sight. One can think of Tiresias, who has lived as both a man and a woman and who is blind. Characters like Oedipus, who is depicted as having a leg deformity. Characters who we would label perhaps as disabled, who actually are seen as having great high status in Greek society. So again, this is something that the movie, I think, gets very wrong. This next clip is from The Clash of the Titans. This is a very powerful myth to the ancient Greeks, which is the myth of Medusa, the Gorgon who could turn you to stone. And Perseus here, one of his kind of rites of passage, his sort of step into manhood, is to go and bring back the head of Medusa and get rid of this horrible chthonic symbol. What I mean by chthonic is a symbol of the earth. So the Greeks sort of divided up their universe in terms of Olympian, which was the sky, which is predominantly controlled by Zeus and male gods, and the earth, which was predominantly female, Gaia, Hera, Rhea. And one of the clues to that is whenever we see snakes, we're dealing with a chthonic image. And we see that in the hairstyle of Medusa, right, who's got these chthonic images of the snake. And why did the Greeks regard the snakes as chthonic? Because I think if you go to Greece and you see a snake, right, they seem to come out of the earth and disappear back into the earth. They're pretty scary, snakes, as well. So that image is very much still with us today. If any of you ever go into a medical facility or ride an ambulance, you'll see a snake wrapped around a staff, right? And that is literally the chthonic symbol of death, the snake being lifted up off the ground, off the earth. Often these are myths of gender wars between male and female figures. And so here's Perseus, right? He's, 17, 18 years old. In becoming a man, he has to go and literally kind of sever himself off from the world of women. So this is very much a story of a young warrior's rite of passage. The lead-back mirror that we're used to seeing today was not invented until maybe the 15th century in Europe. So they never saw true reflections of themselves. They had to look at themselves in polished surfaces, bronze shields, maybe in the water. So the shield, the sort of culminating moment of him looking in the mirror back at Medusa, is also, I think, a kind of musing on this idea of identity, right? Do you really know who you are? And that enables him to have the power to deliver the fatal blow and sever the head. We get a lot of these stories of young men having to kind of conquer their sexuality. So the idea that a beautiful woman can petrify you obviously has sexual connotations, and you've got to kind of defeat that by not actually looking at it and focusing on what your mission is in order to sort of conquer your sexuality and resist the charms of women. That's definitely something that we find in a lot of Greek mythology, and that may be playing into the Medusa myth as well. This scene is from the movie Black Panther.
Millions of years ago, a meteorite made of vibranium, the strongest substance in the universe, struck the continent of Africa, affecting the plant life around it. And when the time of men came, 5 tribes settled on it and called it Wakanda.
The first thing to say is that the Mediterranean world doesn't exist in isolation. And one of the things that has happened is that Greek and Roman mythology has somehow been disconnected, mainly in the 19th century by Europeans, and, to a certain extent whitewashed, right? Taken away from its Mediterranean roots. And, half of the Mediterranean is Africa, right? And we forget that. And the Greeks had a very different attitude to Africa, and that was they saw Ethiopia, Egypt, Kush, Kerma as very ancient and very advanced cultures and civilizations. And we see this reflected here in Black Panther. So, for example, In Book 1 of the Iliad, the gods are not on Olympus. They've actually gone to the only humans who they deign worthy of their company to dine with, and that is the Ethiopians. And then secondly, a lot of what we call Greek mythology are heavily influenced by stories from Africa via Egypt and Kush. I don't think there would be Greek and Roman mythology without these ancient African stories.
The tribes lived in constant war with each other until a warrior shaman received a vision from the panther goddess Bast, who led him to the heart-shaped herb, a plant that granted him superhuman strength, speed, and instincts. The warrior became king and the first Black Panther, the protector of Wakanda.
So the idea of the panther god and then having a mortal who becomes the panther at certain moments to protect his community relates directly, if you think about it, with Heracles, right? Because Heracles is a lion warrior, I should say. And we call this therianthropy, where a human transforms into an animal to do something superhuman, and you tap into the power of that animal in order to protect your community. So we should place Heracles very much in the same world as that.
The Wakandans used vibranium to develop technology more advanced than any other nation. But as Wakanda thrived, the world around it descended further into chaos. To keep vibranium safe, the Wakandans vowed to hide in plain sight, keeping the truth of their power from the outside world.
One thing I love about this movie is this idea that Wakanda's hidden. You've got this incredibly developed ancient culture. And a lot of people responded to that with this movie because that is the truth. Just like Wakanda is hidden, so much of African mythology and ancient history has been hidden to us. Because what's happened is that through enslavement and colonization, we have a view of the continent of Africa that is completely false, particularly its history and its rich culture. We can't just look at the Greeks and Romans in isolation. They are people of the Mediterranean. They trade, speak to, interrelate with the Africans as the Africans do with them. So we have to question why we even call this stuff just Greek and Roman mythology. It's got much wider connotations across the networks of that entire region. In the movie, there's this idea of the astral plane, which is that you can communicate with your ancestors. Your ancestors are going to give you the wisdom you need to pursue through your life, particularly at times of trouble.
Baba.
And ancestor worship is an enormous part of both Greek and Roman culture. The old had very high status in ancient societies because they were the font of knowledge. The Romans actually would take death masks of their ancestors, clay versions of them, and then at certain festivals they would wear the masks of their ancestors and they would parade through the streets in them.
Good morning. How can I help you?
I was just checking out these artifacts. They tell me you're the expert.
You could say that.
Where's this one from?
The Bobo Ashanti tribe, present-day Ghana, 19th century.
To take that mask and put it in a glass case in a museum is the worst thing you can do to that mask. That mask's supposed to be worn by a performer who's been imbued in a whole culture of dancing and performing and telling those stories over centuries. And now it's become like an aesthetic object with a price on it. And I think this movie actually shows that really well.
Now, tell me about this one.
Also from Benin, 7th century. Fula tribe, I believe.
Nah.
I beg your pardon.
It was taken by British soldiers in Benin, but it's from Wakanda, and it's made out of vibranium. Don't trip. I'm gonna take it off your hands for you.
These items aren't for sale.
How do you think your ancestors got these? You think they paid a fair price? Or did they take it like they took everything else?
Here's a character from that culture who's not really allowed to interface with material from his own culture and is actually being schooled on it by somebody who's not from that culture. It's about access, right? And I think one of the things this does is it shows us how if you remove an object from the stories that are told about it and the way it's performed, is that object still operating the same way? I love it that he takes a mask at the end and that becomes his character. And even though he uses it in a negative way, for him it empowers him, and that's his connection with his ancestors. I think often we see these objects in museums films, but we don't think about them in their real cultural context. Black Panther movie makes people think about that. The next clip is from the movie Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?
Go to sleep, you little baby. Go to sleep, you little baby. Your mama's gone away and your daddy's gonna stay. Didn't leave nobody but the baby. Go to sleep.
How to do, ladies? Name of Pete.
In many ways, it's an American Odyssey, although I remember the Coen brothers said they never read the Odyssey and they weren't aware of it. You know, maybe there's an argument that some of these stories entered our collective unconsciousness. Many people who've never read the Odyssey know the story of the sirens. It's one of the tasks that Odysseus faces on his way home. He's told not to listen to the sirens, and yet he's compelled to listen to them, so he tells his crew members to tie him to the mast, and they've all got to put wax in their ears. In the Odyssey, the siren's song is actually offering fame. You know, we'll sing about you, we'll sing your stories. So it's less sexual, I think, in the Odyssey and more about kind of the fame of the hero and the identity of the hero.
Go to sleep, you little baby. Your mama's gone away and your daddy's gonna stay.
So you get that story of the sirens, but also the story of the lotus eaters. They're offered corn alcohol, and you know there's a sense that they're going to be given oblivion. And that's another story in the Odyssey. The crew land on the land of the lotus eaters, and if they eat the lotus, they forget. This is often what a lot of returning warriors do, coming home from war, is they want to obliterate their traumatic memories, any substance that can kind of blot out the pain. So I think that there's a number of references going on here, and then finally the kind of sort of medieval trope of, you know, being turned into a toad. I think America of the Great Depression, it's hard for us now to understand what a cataclysmic event World War I was. This idea of kind of total industrialized war as a global event, and then the knock-on effect that war caused. That is analogous to perhaps the Trojan War, which in Greek mythology is the biggest war the Greeks ever fought. And you do get the sense in the Odyssey of a new society being rebuilt, that Odysseus cannot come home and just be an aristocrat anymore. His success is dependent on Eumaeus, the swineherd. It is dependent on his wife Penelope, on his father, on his son. He's no longer the singular aristocratic hero. So yeah, you definitely get the sense of a changing, uncertain world in the Odyssey that's reflected in this time period. I almost prefer to see myths pop up in something more contemporary, because you're absorbed by the actual story that's being told and by the actors, and then you go, oh wow, that's the sirens, right? But it doesn't kind of pull you away from the story. This is how myth works. So I would argue that this is an example of mythic material actually working and being compelling and helping to tell a new story. This scene is from the movie Wonder Woman.
Long ago, when time was new, the gods ruled the earth. Zeus, king among them. Zeus created beings over which the gods would rule. Beings born in his image. He called his creation man.
There's some fun going on in this story. Nowhere in Greek mythology does Zeus have anything to do with the creation of humanity. In fact, the gods really don't have anything to do with the creation of humanity. Only the first woman, we hear that the Titan Prometheus, whose name means forward thinker, creates Pandora, the first woman, out of clay. And the reason we're told Pandora is created is to basically be a distraction to mankind, because Prometheus has just given them fire, and this starts to make mankind godlike. So we're told in these quite misogynistic myths that in order to distract mankind, they invent women to sort of take them in a different direction. But that's the only myth we get about the origins of any kind of human.
But Zeus's son grew envious of mankind and sought to corrupt his father's creation. This was Ares, the god of war.
Ares in this is really kind of beefed up to be an equal with Zeus. The Greeks actually didn't call Ares the god of war, they called him the god of violence, which I think is quite a profound way to think about a god who's associated with warfare. The Greeks saw Ares as a negative force, so they get that right. But Ares is portrayed in Greek art and mythology as a coward. He kind of gets beaten up by heroes on the battlefield in Homer. He goes running to his dad asking for help. So the kind of idea that Ares could overthrow Zeus is certainly nothing that an ancient Greek would understand.
The gods created us, the Amazons, to influence men's hearts with love and restore peace. to the earth.
I think this idea about Amazons bringing peace and harmony towards men is quite a modern idea, and maybe it's more bound up with modern ideas about gender, right? That this is what women are supposed to provide in particular society, and men are the warriors. So actually it's the opposite. They're very, very warlike. They don't want men around. They were certainly not about peace. You know, there were women warriors, particularly in the steppes region and in what the Greeks call Thrace to the north. We've definitely found graves with women warriors. There was women warriors in the Celtic. If anything like the Amazons actually existed, they would have probably been nomadic tribes, highly skilled, particularly with a bow and arrow. The Amazons were viewed in antiquity of living around the Black Sea coast, either to the south of the Black Sea or north of the Black Sea, sometimes in Ethiopia, in Africa, sometimes in Libya, never on an island. But I actually think that there is some validity in doing that in terms of ancient mythology. The idea of mystical islands and strange things happening on islands is something we encounter in the Odyssey, in Homer. It's a fun idea and it's a good device for the movie.
We give thanks to the gods for giving us this paradise.
And the God Killer?
The God Killer?
The weapon that is strong enough to kill a god.
The thing that makes me laugh is the whole idea of the god killer, because you actually can't kill a god. The whole purpose that Greek gods exist is that they are immortal. So Wonder Woman, of course, you know, I think she's very much influenced by the Amazon Queen Hippolyta, who are associated with Greek heroes like Hercules and Theseus. And I think that they absolutely tapped into that idea of the warrior woman. I think what's interesting about this particular scene is it kind of gets to the heart of what mythology is. You know, the young Wonder Woman has her mother telling her this origin story, and we as an audience also receive that origin story performed. Myth is what we call an etiology. It's there to explain why something is the way it is. And I think that's what makes myths so fascinating, is we can actually analyze them and say, well, why are these stories being told? And what are they communicating? That story is really about us today. It's less about the ancient Greeks and more about perhaps what's going on in our world. And I think that's what made that first movie quite successful, actually. The next clip is from Hercules.
Hercules! Behave yourself.
Oh, look at this. Look how cute he is. Ah! Oh, he's strong, like his dad.
The movie is aiming at kids, and so it kind of elides over some of the most interesting parts of the Heracles myth. The Greek name for him, Heracles, means famous of Hera, and not in a good way. Is Hera, the wife of Zeus, hates Heracles and is constantly trying to destroy him.
Here, keep those away from the baby.
Oh, he won't hurt himself.
As a baby, that scene would never have happened. Heracles would never have been welcomed to Olympus as a child. In fact, Hera sent snakes to kill the infant Heracles, but Heracles was already really strong and wrestled the snakes and killed them.
What about our gift, dear?
Yes. A little Cirrus and, a touch of Nimbostratus. His name is Pegasus, and he's all yours, son.
Heracles and Pegasus are not really connected in any of the Greek mythic material. Pegasus appears in the Perseus myth and other myths related to the house of Perseus. And even though Heracles is from that region, we don't see him associated with Pegasus, so that's something that the movie brought in.
Pain, panic. Got a little riddle for you. How do you kill a god?
I do not know. You can't. They're immortal?
Bingo! They're immortal. So, first you gotta turn the little sunspot mortal.
The other thing is that Hercules doesn't really have this kind of hate relationship with Hades, except you could argue that the movie is riffing on this idea of, can a mortal-born character become immortal? And Heracles is one of the only mortal characters who becomes a god. Now, Hades was actually called the Unseen One, and we have very few depictions of him, so he was sort of seen as being somewhat invisible or somebody that you didn't want to see, but we certainly don't associate Hades with necessarily being a hot place. I mean, that's kind of an image of hell. The Greeks believed that there were certain entrance points to the underworld, and there were these kind of underground rivers that you had to have Chiron the ferryman transport you across. You were buried with money, so you could pay the ferryman for that journey. If you weren't buried, of course, you wandered the shores of the River Styx, never getting across. I actually have visited a number of these sites that are associated with being the entrance to the underworld, and they're actually really compelling, pretty scary stuff. So I think they did a pretty good job encapsulating that, actually. I resist something that we call the fidelity discourse, that there is an original version and that we must be true to that version. That kills the life that's behind a myth. A myth is about performance, is about being spoken, told, enacted, and received by an audience. That's what it means to be human, to share our stories with each other. We want novelty, we want something new. And also culture changes, and culture gets influenced by different cultures, so the stories should change too. So to say that there's an original version of a story is actually to go against the very idea of mythos, right? Which is a traditional story, a story that's handed down. I'm Peter Meineck, Professor of Classics and the Modern World at New York University. Thanks for watching.